Well, here is a decision almost nobody saw coming. For 10 years, the most famous building in Britain has been wrapped in scaffolding, while £369 million was spent putting it right. And now that the work is nearly done, the King has announced that he is not going to live there. Let that sit for a moment. A decade of work, a vast sum of money, a palace fixed up to last another 50 years. And the man it was fixed up for has decided to stay where he is, in a smaller house down the road, and to hand more of the palace over to the public instead. So pour yourself something warm, settle in, and stay with me, because this is one of those royal stories that looks small on the surface, just a question of where someone sleeps and turns out to be about something much bigger. It is about what a palace is actually for in the modern age, and about the kind of monarchy Charles is quietly trying to build. Here is the key fact to anchor on. Speaking during the palace's annual finance briefing, the King's own finance chief, James Chalmers, confirmed that Charles and Camilla will not move into Buckingham Palace after its refurbishment. They will stay at Clarence House, their London home since 2003, and the decision was made, in his words, to greatly increase opportunities for public access. The palace, he stressed, remains what he called Monarchy Headquarters. Just not, it turns out, the King's home. Stay with me, because by the end of this, I think you will see that where a king chooses to sleep can tell you more about the direction of an institution than a dozen grand speeches ever could. This is Richard Valentine. I'm Richard. Let's get into it. It is good to have you here with me again. If you are new to the channel, this is the place where we take a single royal story and slow it right down until the part that actually matters comes into focus. Now, this is a story that could easily be told as pure spectacle, all gilded rooms and big numbers. I'm going to resist that, because underneath the shine, there is a genuinely interesting question about how a modern monarchy presents itself, and that is the part worth your time. I will also, as always, step around the loudest argument of all, the one about whether the monarchy should exist. That is your call, not mine. What I will do is lay out what was decided, why it might have been decided, and the honest readings on both sides. And I will tell you how solid the ground is at each step. Some of this is confirmed, straight from the palace briefing and the major outlets. Some is reported interpretation, and some is my own reading. You will always know which is which. Let's begin with exactly what was announced. Let's trace the announcement itself, because the facts here are clear and well documented. The decision was revealed on the 25th of June during the annual Sovereign Grant briefing, the same event where the King disclosed his personal tax bill for the first time. James Chalmers, the keeper of the Privy Purse, who manages the King's financial affairs, put it plainly. After careful consideration and to greatly increase opportunities for public access, the King and Queen have decided not to adopt Buckingham Palace as a personal residence. Instead, they will continue to use Clarence House as their London home. So this was not a leak or a rumour. It was an official, on-the-record statement, made by the palace itself. There are a few important details that stop this being as dramatic as a headline might suggest, and I want to be fair by including them. First, Charles and Camilla will still work out of Buckingham Palace. It remains, in Chalmers' words, the ceremonial and operational centre of royal life. He called it Monarchy Headquarters, the crown jewel of the national buildings. Second, the King will keep access to private rooms inside the palace, where he can retire during a working day, and which could even serve as living quarters at some point in the future. So this is not the King abandoning the palace. It is the King deciding not to sleep there, while still using it as his main place of work. Now the building itself, because the scale matters. Buckingham Palace was built in the 1820s and has been the London home of every British monarch since Queen Victoria, almost 200 years. It has 775 rooms. It hosts state dinners for visiting presidents, provides offices for the royal bureaucracy, and serves as the great public stage of the monarchy. That famous balcony, where the family gathers to greet the crowds, has marked the end of wars, royal weddings, and grand jubilees. The broad avenue of the Mall runs straight to its gates. In other words, this is not just a house. It is arguably the single most recognizable symbol of the British monarchy on earth. It is worth pausing on what the refurbishment actually involved, because it explains why this was never about luxury. The decade-long program, which began in 2017, was about replacing the building's hidden bones. Plumbing, electrical wiring and heating systems, much of it untouched since shortly after the Second World War, and judged to carry a real risk of fire or flood if left alone. So the money was not spent gilding ceilings. It was spent stopping a national building from failing catastrophically and equipping it to serve for another 50 years. That context matters, because it reframes the cost question. The work needed doing regardless of who would sleep there. Whether it needed doing to the standard of a full royal residence is the sharper question, and we will come back to it. And here is the home he is choosing instead. Clarence House is a 5-bedroom residence less than half a mile from the palace, built in the 1820s by the celebrated architect John Nash in a restrained neoclassical style. It was designed from the start to be more comfortable and more manageable than the grand palaces of its era. Charles has lived there since 2003, and it has been his and Camilla's London home ever since. So the contrast is striking. 775 rooms on one side, 5 bedrooms on the other, the grandest symbol in the land, and a comfortable house down the road. The king is choosing the house. The palace also has a clear future, and the direction is unmistakable. With the royal couple staying put, the palace can open up further to the public. It already receives around 700,000 visitors a year. The stated aim now is to increase that access, host more events, and expand tours. One new feature has been confirmed, called the Consort's Library, transforming 3 historic rooms in the North Wing into a space honouring Prince Albert, Queen Alexandra, the late Prince Philip, and Camilla. It will serve as an audience room and become a new stop on public tours. So the announcement is not just about where the king will not live. It is about turning more of the palace outward, toward the public. So that is the confirmed spine. A king who will work in the palace but not live there. A smaller, long-held home retained instead. And a plan to open the great building wider to the visiting public. Every part of that is documented. But the obvious question is why, and that is where this gets genuinely interesting because there is more than one honest answer. Let me put a few numbers next to each other because the contrast is almost theatrical. £369 million, the cost of the refurbishment. 10 years, the length of the works. 775 rooms in the palace he is not moving into. 5 bedrooms in the house he is keeping. Almost 200 years that Buckingham Palace has been the monarch's London home, a run that, in the everyday sense of actually living there, now pauses. And 700,000 visitors a year, a figure the palace now wants to push higher. Hold those side by side, and you can feel the shape of the decision. The grandest possible stage, kept for the public and the ceremony, and a quieter home kept for the man. Keep that in mind as we ask why. Let's unpack the possible reasons now, because the palace gave one explanation, and there are others worth laying alongside it, all without pretending to read anyone's mind. The official reason is public access, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away. On this account, the logic is simple. Buckingham Palace is a national treasure, and if the king is not living in it, far more of it can be open to the people who, in a sense, own it as a piece of national heritage. More tours, more events, more of the year when the public can walk through rooms that would otherwise sit private. Given that the palace already draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, removing the constraint of it being a full-time royal residence genuinely does free it up. That is a coherent, stated reason, and it lines up with a wider push we have seen from this king toward a more open, less remote institution. But there is a second, more human and practical layer that many royal watchers have noted, and it is worth stating carefully and factually. Charles has lived at Clarence House for over 2 decades. It is, by every account, his settled home. People in their 70s do not always relish uprooting their entire domestic life to move into a vast, formal palace, however magnificent. I am not going to claim to know the king's private feelings about this, because I cannot, and it would be unfair to pretend otherwise. But as a simple, observable fact, choosing to stay in a comfortable, familiar home rather than move into a 775-room palace is an entirely understandable human preference, and it would be odd to ignore it as part of the picture. It is also worth remembering that Charles has consistently demonstrated this instinct, which makes the decision feel less like a sudden whim and more like a settled pattern. Long before he became king, as Prince of Wales, he was associated with a more pared-back, purpose-driven idea of royal life, and Clarence House has been his base throughout. There is a continuity here. A man who has lived in the same comfortable home for over 2 decades, and who has long signalled a preference for a leaner style, choosing to carry that into his reign rather than abandon it for grandeur the moment he could. Seen that way, the surprise is less that he is staying put, and more that anyone expected him to move at all. There is a third angle, the symbolic and financial one, and this is where it connects to everything else happening this week. This announcement did not arrive alone. It came on the very same day as the King's historic tax disclosure, and in the same period as his son's overhaul of the Duchy of Cornwall and the reset of the sovereign grant. Taken together, these are the moves of an institution working hard to look modern, accessible, and careful with money and symbolism. A monarch choosing not to occupy the most opulent palace in the land and opening it to the public instead fits that story almost perfectly. By my reading, you cannot fully understand this decision in isolation. It is one beat in a deliberately orchestrated week about a more open, more grounded crown. Now, the palace itself has been careful about how it frames all this, and the framing is revealing. Chalmers described the decision as both a change from the past and a recognition of the future, and reports suggested that those inside the palace see this as controlled evolution, not dramatic abdication. That phrase is worth holding on to. Controlled evolution. The institution wants this read as a measured, sensible modernization, not as the king turning his back on tradition. Whether it fully succeeds in controlling that reading is, of course, not entirely up to the palace. Once a decision like this is public, people interpret it for themselves, which is exactly what we are going to examine next. So the reasons are layered: a stated aim of public access, an understandable human preference for a settled home, and a symbolic fit with a weak design to show a modern, careful monarchy. None of these cancels the others. They likely all play a part. But how you weigh them shapes how you read the whole thing, and that is where opinion genuinely divides. Let me put a question straight to you, because your instinct here is interesting. If you had spent 10 years and a fortune restoring a grand old family house, and then chose to keep living in your comfortable cottage next door and open the big house to visitors, what would your neighbours say? Some would call it generous and sensible. Others would mutter that you should have just moved in after all that expense. Both reactions are completely natural, and they are exactly the 2 reactions the king is now getting on a national scale. Sit with which one is closer to your own gut response, then let's look at both properly. Let's examine the timing and the symbolism more closely, because this decision works on 2 levels at once, and separating them helps a lot. On the practical level, very little actually changes day to day. The king already lives at Clarence House and works at Buckingham Palace, and that arrangement simply continues. In that sense, the announcement formalizes the status quo rather than upending anything. He was never going to be tucked up in the palace during the long refurbishment anyway, so one honest way to read this is that it is less a dramatic new departure and more an official confirmation of how things already were, dressed up as a decision. But on the symbolic level, it is a much bigger statement, and symbols matter enormously for an institution that runs almost entirely on them. For nearly 2 centuries, the reigning monarch living in Buckingham Palace was simply a given. The sovereign and the palace were, in the public mind, almost the same thing. A king choosing not to live there, even while still working there, quietly breaks that link. It says the person and the building can be separated, and it reframes the palace subtly from the monarch's private home into something closer to a public institution that the monarch happens to run. The way I see it, that symbolic shift is the real story here, far more than the question of where Charles sleeps. And the timing sharpens that symbolism. Dropping this on the same day as the first ever royal tax disclosure was not an accident of the calendar. It allowed the 2 stories to reinforce each other. A king who shows his tax bill and declines to live in the grandest palace on the same morning is presenting a single coherent image. Open about money, modest about grandeur. Whether you find that image sincere or stage-managed is precisely the debate. But that it was a constructed image, assembled deliberately, is hard to dispute. Institutions do not release their biggest transparency gestures and their biggest symbolic gestures on the same day by chance. I want to give a balanced view of the substance, though, and not let the choreography swallow it. Even if the timing was managed, the underlying decisions are real. The tax really was disclosed. The palace really will be opened up more. The king really is staying in a smaller home. Pointing out that something is well presented does not make it fake. A genuine decision and a careful rollout can be the same event. By my reading, the honest stance is to notice the stagecraft without using it to dismiss the substance, because both the substance and the stagecraft are really there. So we have a decision that is, practically, almost a non-event, and, symbolically, a meaningful break with 2 centuries of habit, rolled out as part of a carefully built week. Hold all of that together, and we are ready to weigh the 2 genuine ways people are reading it, because this is where thoughtful observers part company. I will be honest about a temptation in a story like this. The lazy version writes itself, and it goes one of 2 ways. Either it is a gushing piece about a humble modern king too down to earth for a palace, or it is a sneering piece about an out-of-touch monarch wasting hundreds of millions on a house he will not even use. Both are easy, both get clicks, and both flatten a genuinely layered decision into a cartoon. I have tried to resist both, because you deserve the version that holds the practical, the human and the symbolic together, even when that is harder to say in a sentence. If that makes this less of a cheer or a jeer than some takes out there, I think that is the right call. Now, let's weigh it properly. Let's weigh the 2 honest readings now, because both are reasonable, and which one lands for you probably reflects how you already see this king. The first reading is the approving one. On this view, the decision is a smart and even admirable piece of modern monarchy. The king is declining to install himself in 775 rooms of state grandeur, and choosing instead to open that grandeur to the public, while living modestly in the home he already knows. It signals a monarch who understands that, in the current age, visible restraint plays better than visible opulence. It puts a great national building to wider public use, and it fits a broader, genuine pattern from Charles of trying to slim down and modernize the institution. Supporters would say this is exactly the kind of quiet, sensible modernization that helps a centuries-old monarchy stay relevant, and that he deserves credit for choosing it over simply taking the palace as his due. The second reading is the more skeptical one, and it has real bite. It asks an obvious and fair question. If the king was never going to live there, why did the refurbishment cost the public £369 million in the first place? On this view, spending a fortune to make a palace fit for a monarch to live in, and then announcing the monarch will not live in it, invites awkward questions about planning and value. Critics might also read the public access framing as a convenient gloss on what is, at heart, simply a personal preference to stay in a comfortable home, repackaged as generosity. And the more cynical would see the whole thing, timed to the tax disclosure, as polished public relations, a carefully staged gesture of humility that costs the king very little while buying him a great deal of goodwill. It is worth weighing the cost question with real care, because it is the primary point of contention for critics, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissal. The fairest version of the point is not that the money was simply wasted. As we covered, much of the work, the wiring, the plumbing, the fire and flood risk genuinely needed doing, whoever lived there. The harder question, however, is narrower. Was the building done up specifically to be a livable royal residence, to a standard a working palace would not otherwise need on the assumption the monarch would move in? If so, then deciding afterward not to live there does leave a real question about planning and value. To my eye, the most honest thing to say is that the essential repairs were justified regardless, and the residence question is a legitimate one that the palace has not yet fully answered. Here is where I think the honest position sits, and it is a real both-and. Both readings are pointing at something true. Yes, opening the palace more widely is a genuine public good, and choosing modesty over grandeur is a defensible, even sensible instinct for a modern monarch. And yes, it is entirely fair to ask why so much was spent preparing a residence that will not be used as one, and to notice how neatly the whole thing was staged. By my reading, the most accurate description is that this is a sensible decision, arrived at for a mix of genuine and convenient reasons, and presented with real skill. You can think the choice is wise and still raise an eyebrow at the £369 million question. Those two thoughts sit together perfectly well. And notice the deeper question underneath, the one this single decision gestures toward without answering. What should a palace like Buckingham actually be in the 21st century? a living royal residence, as it has been for 200 years. A public museum and ceremonial stage, owned in spirit by the nation? Or some hybrid of the two, which is roughly what is now emerging? People will answer that very differently. This decision nudges the palace a step away from private home and toward public institution. Whether that is the right direction is exactly what the coming years and your own judgment will decide. This is the kind of story where your comments tend to be sharper than any single take, and I read them all. Whenever the palace and royal money come up on this channel, the responses split in fascinating ways. Some of you love the idea of more of the palace being open to ordinary visitors, and see real value in that. Others come straight to the cost, and ask the hard question about why hundreds of millions went into a home that will not be lived in. Both of those instincts are completely fair, and they pull in different directions. So when we reach the end, I would genuinely like to know where you land, and why. That conversation is usually wiser than anything I could conclude alone. Let's bring it home. Let's turn, finally, to the bigger picture, because where a king lives is, in the end, a story about what kind of monarchy he wants to leave behind. Step back and the pattern is unmistakable. This decision is one thread in a tightly woven week, the first ever disclosure of a monarch's tax bill, the heir reshaping his vast estate toward housing and the environment, the sovereign grant reset and, on the headline measure, reduced for the first time, and now a king declining the grandest palace in favor of a modest home and wider public access. Whatever you make of any single piece, the direction is consistent. This is an institution deliberately presenting itself as more open, more careful, and less remote than the monarchy of the past. Charles, it seems, is using the ordinary levers available to him, where he lives, what he discloses, how the money is framed, to define the character of his reign. There is a real question of institutional survival humming underneath all of this, and it is worth naming plainly. Monarchies that have lasted have tended to be the ones that adapted to the mood of the public that sustains them, bending at the right moments, rather than standing rigid. A century ago, a monarch refusing to live in the principal palace would have been close to unthinkable. That it now reads as sensible modernization, rather than crisis, tells you how much the expectations around the crown have shifted. By my reading, this decision is best understood as part of that long adaptation, an institution reading the room and adjusting its most visible symbols to match what a modern public seems to want. It is fair to say there is a genuine debate about whether this is the right way to adapt, and good faith people sit on different sides. One view holds that opening the palace and embracing a more modest royal footprint is exactly the kind of sensible, forward-looking change that keeps the monarchy in step with the country. The other view, voiced by some royal commentators, worries about the practicalities and the symbolism, hoping the palace does not simply sit half empty and wanting to see a bolder, clearer vision for what it becomes. One historian who studies the monarchy's future said openly that he hoped for what he called a second act for the building, and a more radical proposal for its purpose. That is not opposition so much as a challenge to go further. I am not going to settle that because it is a question about the institution's direction, and reasonable people weigh it differently. And that brings me to the question I want to leave you with. When the king chooses the small house over the great palace and opens that palace to the public, what are you really watching? A genuinely modern monarch, matching his living arrangements to the humbler mood of the times, and turning a national treasure outward toward the people. Or a beautifully staged gesture, a personal preference dressed as public generosity, with an awkward question about hundreds of millions left hanging underneath. By my reading, the truthful answer is that it is both at once, and that the most interesting thing about it is not where Charles sleeps, but what the decision quietly says. That the monarch and the palace are no longer quite the same thing. After 200 years, that is a genuine shift. And like most real change in this institution, it arrived not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet decision about where to call home. Quick aside before we close. You will have noticed I kept refusing to land this as either a humble king story or a wasteful king story, and that was deliberate. The pull toward a clean verdict is strong, because a tidy take is satisfying, and a both-and is not. But this decision genuinely is layered. The public access is real, the human preference is understandable, the staging is skillful, and the cost question is fair, all at the same time. Flattening that into a single judgment would be the easy lie. So I held the line. Just wanted you to know that was a choice. Now let's finish. And that is where we will leave it today. Thank you for staying with me through the careful version of this story, the one that treats a decision about a home as the window it really is, onto a changing institution. I know the louder takes are out there, the pure praise and the pure mockery. The fact that you chose the one that holds the whole picture means a great deal, and it is the reason I keep making these. Now I would genuinely like to hear from you, and I doubt you will all agree, which is what makes it worth asking. When you weigh it up, what do you see? A smart, modern monarch opening a national treasure to the public and living modestly by choice. Or an expensive puzzle, a palace done up at great cost for a king who will not live in it, with a generous gloss on a simple preference. And what would you like Buckingham Palace to actually become, now that it will not be a full-time royal home? There is no wrong answer here, only your honest read of it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone, and the conversations down there are easily the best part of running this channel. And before you go, here is what is coming next. We are stepping away from palaces and finances entirely, and turning to something far more tender. As we reach the 1st of July, we are going to look back at a figure whose memory still shapes this family decades on, and at the quiet ways her legacy lives in the monarchy even now. It is a gentler, more reflective episode, handled with the care it deserves. So if you have not yet, subscribe and switch on your notifications so it reaches you the moment it lands. Until then, take good care of yourself. I'm Richard, and I will see you again very soon.